Dejounte Murray is going to energize one area of the Pelicans offense despite whatever happens with Brandon Ingram. I'll tell you how the pick and roll can be elite for New Orleans next season. It's the Wednesday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Wednesday. The show is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. This week we'll have a regular show tomorrow for you. And then tomorrow night, Thursday night, 8 p.m. Central, we are doing a live show where I'm just going to interact with y'all, take your questions. So you kind of get four shows this week on Locked On Pelicans. So join the live show on YouTube, get your questions in. We'll answer it all. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the Number One Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10K Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So let's get into this. The rundown of the show today, Dejounte Murray and the Pelicans offense in the pick and roll. I want to look at a couple of things there. And say Brandon Ingram doesn't get moved because Lauri Markkanen signed his extension. Kind of takes a trade domino off the table here. Ingram doesn't get moved because the Warriors aren't interested. What's a fair extension? What's the amount for him and why might he go for something like that? Then I want to get into the Pelicans name and uniform because I was reminded of this the other day and I posted on Twitter about it. So Dejounte Murray, being the main addition for the Pelicans this offseason, obviously, I'm pretty high on this move. I think most people, if you're a Pelicans fan, have liked this move for what it adds to this team. This is someone who defensively is going to fit right in. I think you're going to see, him going back to kind of being the best defensive version of himself. And while he's not maybe like, a massive volume three-point shooter or things like that, that kind of like unlocks this offense in terms of spacing around Zion Williamson, I do think he is a very good fit for what he's going to be able to provide to this team. And that has to do with the pick and roll, and it's an area that New Orleans has not been particularly elite in, let's say. And I don't mean they've been bad either, and I don't even think they've necessarily been middle of the road. I think they can be above that. But here's how he's going to add to that, and that's what I want to look at here. So we're going to get into some numbers. The Pelicans offense last season ended up being ranked 11th, but it was really inconsistent. Some really great games followed by a lot of stinkers too. So that's an average number. Last year, the pick and roll, there's two ways that this gets tracked in the NBA. There's the pick and roll ball handler and then the pick and roll man. This is how the play finishes. So if Zion is rolling after setting the screen, gets a lob, dunks it down, that is a pick and roll man finish. If this is the ball handler coming off a screen and scoring or doing something like that, then that is also going to be classified as the pick and roll ball handler. Pick and roll ball handler is often more used than the pick and roll man in the NBA, unless you're the New Orleans Pelicans. The top team in the league had 22.2% of their offense in terms of frequency in the Charlotte Hornets in the pick and roll with the pick and roll man, so they're guards. The bottom was the Denver Nuggets, and this makes sense at 13%. You don't need guards when you have Nikola Jokic. The Pelicans were also sixth fewest in terms of frequency. They ran and finished plays with a pick and roll ball handler 14.3% of the time. But here's the thing. They were decent at it. They were pretty decent at this area. They actually had 11th. They were 11th best in terms of efficiency and scoring with it. The problem was they just didn't do it enough. Well, Dejounte Murray is a guy that can absolutely run the pick and roll for you more. And in fact, for the Atlanta Hawks, who are one of the top teams in terms of pick and roll frequency, you saw Murray do it a ton. Of his time on the court with the Atlanta Hawks, he ran in about a third of the time. Every shot attempt he took was out of the pick and roll. That's where a lot of his mid-rangers come in from. They're kind of pull-up mid-rangers off of a pick and roll where there is some space. He is good at that shot, and that's different than like a contested mid-range jumper that you've worked hard to manufacture, or you just played with your back to the basket, turned around and tried to shoot over somebody. Here, when you have space like that, it can be a useful shot, and Murray was very good at taking advantage of that. He didn't rank super high in terms of efficiency last year, though the year before that he did. Part of that was he couldn't draw fouls, couldn't get to the line. But I think he's going to be able to do more of that, and this team is going to be able to do more of that. So now you have a guard that can simply run it. The Pelicans were 11th last season. Now you have a guard that can get you into your sets and run a pretty efficient play for you far more often than you've ever had before. That's going to make their offense better, right? Just simply running more pick and rolls for this team that finished with the ball handler because they were good at it because of Zion Williamson, right? He's a factor in all of this. He's going to create space for those guys, whether it's at the rim, whether it's in mid-range, to just attack the basket because, look, you can do this a bunch. You can finish it with Zion. He's the bigger threat. Murray's going to have space. That then means he's going to be more efficient in the pick and roll. So yes, they were 11th last year, but that number is now going to go up in efficiency. They're going to finish probably close to 5th, I'd be willing to bet this year, in terms of pick and roll ball handler efficiency compared to last season. Murray is going to have tons of space, and he's willing to do that. The only other guard that can run the pick and roll for New Orleans effectively was CJ McCollum last year. Jose couldn't score out of that. That's not his strong suit. CJ could with that mid-range kind of floater game that he's had and broke out a lot last year that you saw with certain lineups. Murray's better. Murray can also attack and at least get to the rim and finish pretty well there with some of the strength that he has. This is also going to open up his game to be able to shoot more free throws, I think. Zion's going to draw a lot of attention, but those guys will rotate over. Now, either Murray just absorbs the contact, tries to score, goes to the line, that works, or he finds a way to get the ball to Zion Williamson. This is something that should make New Orleans terrifying in the pick and roll and really elevate their games and thus open other things up, right? That's the other part of this. By attacking in the pick and roll, you're going to create more open three-point shots if this frequency is up. Now, this doesn't show how often you pass out of it, things like that. That's something that we've got to really watch for, but I'd be willing to bet as their efficiency in the pick and roll goes up, you're going to see teams collapsing even more. And if you put the right shooters out there on the court to make teams pay, because that's what we've talked about, they're going to be able to do this. This is why figuring out the starting lineup and maybe getting a guy like Trey Murphy in there is going to be a really important thing. Or Brandon Ingram taking more spot-up three-point shots, which he can do. But this is going to open things up in a way that New Orleans hasn't had before, and I'm pretty excited. That's one of the biggest reasons why I like this Dejounte Murray trade so much for New Orleans. So coming up next, we said if Ingram's in the starting lineup, and right now it's looking more like he's not going to get moved than he is. We have a bit of an update on that we'll tell you. But say he stays, and New Orleans signs him to an extension, goes, we're gonna go forward with Brandon Ingram. What's a fair extension? He's not going to get the $208 million, but I have a number that is less than that I do think makes a lot of sense. Let's look at what that is. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked on Pelicans. As I hit all of my buttons here. Today's episode of Locked on Pelicans is brought to you by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or therapy day. When your schedule is packed with kids' activities, recording podcasts late at night, it's easy to let your priorities slip. Even when you know what makes you happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you've no time yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Look, therapy isn't just for people who've experienced major trauma. It's just to learn coping skills, how to set boundaries. Basically, just empowers you to be the best version of you. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. I love that it's entirely online. That way you don't need to drive to a doctor's office, anything like that. You just fill out a questionnaire and they're going to match you with a licensed therapist. So never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the number one Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And now for your second listen. Locked On NBA. There's no offseason in the NBA, and Locked On NBA, which, by the way, I'm on today, provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On there, we talked about Canada going out and how that leads to really big questions about Jamal Murray's play and his kind of time and what it means for the Denver Nuggets. They might be dropping. Like, they're betting big on Jamal Murray, and I don't know if that's what you want to bet on right now. He averaged 6 points in the Olympics per game. That's pretty bad. We laugh at Rudy Gobert, and we actually talked about Brandon Ingram and Zach LaVine as trade targets too. So that's the Locked On NBA podcast today. You should go give it a listen just because I'm on there. So let's keep talking about Brandon Ingram. It's not looking like a deal right now is going to end up happening. We've seen some things maybe about the Utah Jazz. We talked about that yesterday. But talking to someone with the Jazz, they seem to think they're more likely to try and tank rather than kind of go all in and put a star around Brandon Ingram. We'll see if that ends up being true or not. Putting another star next to Lauri Markkanen. But I don't know. It seems like in this draft, they want to go grab another guy, and we'll see what that ends up happening with that. You also saw Shams on the Pat McAfee show, I think, saying there's not really a big market for Brandon Ingram and that the Warriors are not interested in him. You know, they had been going for Markkanen, but if they didn't get him and obviously didn't, do they pivot to Brandon Ingram? And I don't think that's going to be the case here. So if he ends up staying in New Orleans, what's a fair deal for him? Like, what's the fair market value for a lightly used Brandon Ingram here? He's still young. Like, he is still younger, I think, than people realize. And this is someone who, even though this is going to be his 9th year in the NBA, like, is just entering his prime. He'll be 27 next season. It's not like he's old or anything like that, right? So there's still time for him to grow, change, be the best version of himself. And we even talked about that last week on Locked On Pelicans for the everydayers of what that would look like. But say he's going to stay here. What's the extension, right? You really don't want to risk letting him go for nothing at the end of next season or trading him for pennies on the dollar at the NBA's trade deadline. So what do you do? So let's look, and it starts with the expected salary cap in 2025-2026 when his contract would go into play, essentially. It's expected to be right around $154.6.7 million. It's basically a 10% increase from the number that they've had this year. That's kind of how this is going to go. It's going to go up 10% basically every year for the foreseeable future. That's actually the most that the salary cap can rise. If you're interested in why it's capped at 10%, capped is not the right word. That's because they want to avoid those big cap spikes that allowed the Golden State Warriors the ability to sign Kevin Durant when they were really good. The cap went up like 20-something% that season, and it kind of, that's the year that the Pelicans gave Solomon and Hill that contract. Everybody had money to spend, and not everybody spent it well. And some teams lucked out, teams in big markets that were already good that shouldn't be able to add a Kevin Durant kind of player. So 10% raises every single season. So right now, Brandon Ingram's deal is basically 25% of the salary cap. That's what I kind of think of him as a player. His max deal right now, based on years of service, is 30%. So he could get that $208 million is 30% of the salary cap. Had he made an All-NBA team, he would have been in line for 35% of the salary cap, by the way, which absolutely not. 30% just doesn't feel right. Like, to me, he is in between a 20 to 25% of the salary cap player. And that's a way we need to start looking at contracts going forward. Some of these numbers are going to be astronomically high. You will see by the end of this current TV deal, I think the max on a player is going to be $92 or $98 million in a season, right? That's nuts. That's a high end, but still almost $100 million. Rather than trying to compare contracts, think of it in terms of percent of the salary cap, I think is going to be easier. 25% on the high end for Brandon Ingram, I think seems okay, right? You can convince me of that for his level of play right now. More than that, no. Less would be ideal, and I think that's in play, but 25%. So what's 25% going into the future here? And one of the things to factor in with NBA contracts is they get raises. So you might start at 25% of the salary cap, but you get an 8% raise on your deal every year. So that's why you kind of see numbers go up most of the time. So 25% of the salary cap next season is $38.5 million. So if we're signing him to a 4-year deal with 8% raises and it starts at $38.5 million, like, I don't hate that, to be perfectly honest, and I'll explain why in a minute. This year he's making 36. Essentially $2.5 million more on his extension doesn't seem, awful in terms of just money going up, right? Like, that almost feels like he's losing money in a sense in this. So first year is $38.5 million. Next year is 41.58, 44.91 in the third year, and then the final year is 48.5. If you were to get his max deal right now at 4 years, $208 million, it's an average annual value of 52. He doesn't touch that in any single year here. That, I think, is actually a pretty decent contract. So it's about $173.5 million total. I think if you could get him at 170 over 4 years, that's a good contract. And this is for two reasons. I do think at the end of, say, a 25% a year contract, he's going to be pretty tradable. Like, that's a guy that you could move. So one of the things to keep in mind, and we said this here, is 8% raises. He's getting an 8% raise on his contract every year. But the salary cap sounds like it's going to be going up 10% every year. So his deal starts at 25% of the salary cap, but actually gets smaller than that percentage every single year. I think the final year of this, if we go by the projections, is something like 22 to 23% of the salary cap. Basically, like, his contract in a sense, like, isn't beating inflation like that, right? Like, which isn't the best analogy or an exact thing, but I don't know, that jumped to mind with it all. That seems okay to me. Like, that seems like absolutely an okay number for him that will be tradable in the future. Him in the final year on $48.5 million is 23% of the salary cap then is pretty good. I think it's a fair deal. I also think this is in line a little bit with OG Anunoby's deal with the New York Knicks. And when you look at Anunoby's role on that Knicks team, I do think it somewhat falls in line with Brandon Ingram's, right? Jalen Brunson is the unquestioned leader of that team. He just got named captain, whatever that means. Julius Randle, I think, is ahead of OG Anunoby when he's healthy. Randle is a very good player, a 2-time All-NBA guy so far. We remember his time here in New Orleans, and it seems like he's put some of those issues to bed, particularly playing defense. You've Randle ahead of him. They just traded for Bridges too. That's something to kind of consider in mind, that he's the third or fourth option. Look, you Brandon Ingram fans are going to like this, but with Zion being the number one guy, who's two? Is it now Dejounte Murray? Is it still Brandon Ingram? Maybe. Trey Murphy's going to make a claim for some of that, I think, with his scoring prowess, right? You still have CJ McCollum and all of that. Who's kind of the number two guy, scoring guy on this team? Ingram, you could make the claim is 3 or 4, depending on what his role should be here in New Orleans. This is in line with a guy that's kind of, I'd say third on his team. Ingram being third best player on the team, kind of like hierarchy being the third guy. Yeah. So pay him accordingly. And, he can take a chance on getting money elsewhere. But I do think that this is probably like a pretty sobering moment for him. The Golden State Warriors need a big name and a player like Brandon Ingram, and it doesn't sound like they have any interest. Atlanta didn't want to trade for him and include him in a deal and send, one of their big men back, right? This should be one of those moments where you're like, oh boy, like, my market isn't what I thought. That hurts. It sucks. I want everyone to get paid. But I think Brandon Ingram might need to kind of look in the mirror and be like, yeah, this is kind of like where it is now, where his representation needs to do that. And it's not a fun position, and I get it, but something that, it looks like really might be the case here for him. So 25% starting, making, $274 million, is a pretty good payday. But yeah, one of those things where you're like, oh, that isn't really what I was hoping for in terms of the contracts that he signed in the past and was expecting. But I don't know if that's going to be out there on the market otherwise for him. But I think that's a fair extension, right? Like, that pays him. It gives him his value. It's not a complete lowball where he feels disrespected, or it's like, you're this level of player. This is a fair number, I think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. So brought up by something from 11 years ago. The other day, 11 years ago, I was there in person when the Pelicans unveiled their uniforms. I want to talk about that because the name's not going anywhere like a lot of y'all were screaming here in the comments. And I can give you maybe a little bit of insight into the uniforms and things like that for next season. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. No NBA right now, but you still got Major League Baseball going on. So if you want to get in on who's hitting a ball out of the park, who's knocking out a home run, strikeouts, whatever it is, whatever kind of action you want to get in on while you're kind of waiting for the NBA to come back, FanDuel is going to let you keep the sports going whenever you want because all you have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Team USA, heavy favorite over Serbia. Serbia and Jokic going to make it closer. What about France versus Germany? France upset Canada. You can get in on that action here with the Olympics over at FanDuel. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the official sports betting partner of Locked On. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And for your second listen today, Ross Jackson, Locked On Saints, boots on the ground in Irvine, California, covering everything. Go give Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make that your second listen today. So this was 11 years ago. On August 1 was when the Pelicans unveiled their uniforms. Not the name. That had leaked earlier in one of like the funniest things where, by the way, to this day, if you just Google New Orleans Pelicans and look at the images, like the first image that comes up, I think, just because it's been like SEO'd like to the ground is like the screenshot of the logo leaking in like a promotional video, which is just something that's always been kind of funny to me that it's like still one of the most like searched images when it comes to that. You know, they announced the uniforms on August 1st. I was there at the practice facility on Airline looking at all of it where it was just really the blue, the white, and that was it. No red jersey, no alternate or anything like that just yet. You know, these weren't loved in the beginning. They've made some changes. The font for New Orleans was like straight up too small. You know, I think looking back on this, you could argue that red should have been, you know, one of the main colors. And yeah, it's not been really changed. At least like the home whites and then the blue haven't really changed in a very long time, right? Like they're more or less the same, just the we mentioned here. The reds we love, but they recently changed that. Some of the city edition jerseys have been good. They're not going to really change a ton, I don't think, just yet. There will be some changes coming. You know, I've seen a lot of people saying, change the Pelicans name because we were remembering the rebrand and hoping for different things. Pelicans ain't going anywhere. We know that one for sure. I can say probably a little bit about this is that, you know, we like the skeleton, and I did a show saying they should just rebrand to the skeleton. You see NBA teams change logos, keep the same name, but they change the logos. The Clippers just did this. The Atlanta Hawks have done it. You know, the Pistons have brought back old logos from the past, like the Flame Horse and all of that. Those are things that teams do like somewhat regularly, and the Pelicans haven't. They slightly changed their logo last year by just kind of moving the wording around on the official logo, which no one needs to kind of get in depth about. And so they're not changing that stuff very much. You will, from what I understand, though, see the skeleton again. It's not going to be the main jerseys. The neon and everything won't be the main colors, but I think you're going to see a riff on the black and green and purple and the skeleton logo because they understand how well received that was by the fan base and how everyone just wanted something really, really different. I think you're going to see some of that again this coming year. And I don't know, I like it. Like, look, I think the red that they wear looks really good. I always like that. You know, you'd like maybe the whites to be changed, the blues to be changed, maybe a different wording on the front instead of New Orleans. You could do something else. They have options to do, I think, some of those big changes here, and you might see some of that. But know that the skeleton and I think that color scheme is coming back for next season. And so that, I don't know, is at least encouraging because we love that, even if they won't do a complete brand refresh or anything like that. Do you think they need a complete brand refresh? Should they use the skeleton? Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. And that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. This has been the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'll see y'all tomorrow.